Hi, welcome to a hands-on segment in this week's lecture. And in this segment, we are going to use the AWS Codebuild service to build a Java application. Now, I've already gone ahead and created a sample Java application that is publicly available on GitHub. And what we're going to do is we are going to fork that Java repository so that GitHub will then create a copy of the repository in our personal account. We will then use the Codebuild service to build a build environment which will clone that repository from our personal GitHub account and then perform a Java build on that code in the repository, ultimately creating a jar file. And Codebuild will automatically upload that jar file to an S3 bucket. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is we will clone that GitHub repository. So I will go to the repository URL, which is the SCIS 665 Java project. And I want to fork this repository. That effectively creates a copy of the repository in my personal account. I will say fork. I want to fork it to my personal repository. And now it's forking the repo, which usually only takes maybe 10-15 seconds. Okay, now I have a copy of the repository, a fork of the repository in my personal GitHub account. And before I create the build project within AWS Codebuild, I want to take a look at the repository here that I have forked. And you'll notice that it has a source directory, and this is where you might find some source files. This is a very simple Java application that has a few very simple classes. So there's the source code for my Java application. There is a build XML file. We're going to use a build tool called Ant, which we can use to build Java applications. And Ant looks at this build.xml file to understand how to build the Java application. And it's not important for you to really understand the Java source code or how Ant works. The only thing that's important to understand is kind of what's going on in the bigger picture. We're using Codebuild to clone down this repository. We're going to use Ant to actually build the Java application and run unit tests on the Java application, and that's going to generate a jar file. We have a test XML file, and that is where we describe the unit tests for the Java application. And then finally, we have a build spec.yaml file. If you recall from the previous segment of the lecture, the build spec YAML file is where we describe the different phases of the build process. We have an install phase where we specify a runtime environment, application environment, and here we're using Java OpenJDK 8. We have a pre-build phase, and there we're running two commands. One is the env command, the environment command, which will print out all of the environment variables that are currently set. And then we have in the ant command, and that's, again, a Java build tool, which will, in this case, it's going to use the test XML file to invoke a test suite. So it will run a series of unit tests. In the build phase, we run the ant command again, but this time we are passing in the build XML file, and ant will actually build the Java jar file. That artifact, which is created by the build process, by the ant command, will then be stored in the dist/rectangle.jar file. And that's the artifact that's going to be created and ultimately uploaded into S3. So that's what the Java project looks like. And before we create the build project in Codebuild, we need to create an S3 bucket that we're going to use to store our build artifact. And I've already gone ahead and done that in my account. I created an S3 bucket called Codebuild-Java-JBaker. So you can go ahead and create a bucket like that in your account. Okay, now I've already gone to the Codebuild web console, and I'm going to show you how you manually create a build project. And then I will also take a look at the CloudFormation version of this, because I want you to try to build it manually first, but from now on we will always use CloudFormation. We'll always use code to define our build project. So I'm in the Codebuild web dashboard. I'm going to go ahead and create a build project. And I start by giving the build project a name. I'm just going to call it Java-project. We can give it a description if we want to. And next we need to define the source. Where is the code that the Codebuild service will attempt to build? And in our case, the source provider is going to be in GitHub. We're pulling it from a GitHub repository. And the repository that we cloned, that we forked, is a public repository. And all I need to do is provide the repository URL. Now, it's not going to be the SCIS 665. It's going to be in your personal account. So I'm going to change this to github.com/jasondbaker/java-project, because that is my personal account, and that's where I want the build to be, the source code to be pulled from. Okay. And then next, we are going to go down to environment. And this is where we can define the build environment. Think of this as a server that Codebuild is going to spin up for us, and that contains the software necessary to build our software code. We're going to use a managed image for this example. Remember, I mentioned that you can actually build your own image if you want to, your own build environment. You can build a custom one if the managed images don't meet your needs. For the operating system, I will select Ubuntu. And for the runtime, I will select the standard runtime. And for the image, I'm going to select the standard 2.0 image. We could specify a specific version of that image, but that's not necessary for this example. We're just going to use the latest image that is available. And again, what we're doing here is we are specifying what that build server is going to look like, what kind of software is going to be on there. And you might be asking, well, how do you really know what's on there? Well, you can go look at the documentation that AWS provides to learn more about what these different runtimes and images have available on them. Next, we need to define a new service role. And the service role is going to be something that the build server uses to access other resources within our account, such as our S3 bucket that we created that'll serve as an artifact repository. In this example, we're just going to let AWS create the IAM role for us, and it's already given it sort of a name, a unique name, which should work. I'm going to scroll down. It's asking for a build spec file, and it's asking if we're using a build spec file. And by default, it's checked. And of course, we do have a build spec YAML file in our code repository. And when that repository is cloned down to the build environment, the AWS Codebuild service will automatically look for that build spec file. It is possible to do a build without a build spec file. We could insert the build commands directly in the build project configuration, but I always think it's best to use a build spec file. It allows us to manage the build process within the actual code repository itself. And finally, we can specify in the build project how artifacts are going to be handled. We do have artifacts, and they're going to be stored in Amazon S3. We need to select our Codebuild bucket that's going to store those output artifacts, and that's the S3 bucket that you created earlier. And we're going to keep scrolling down. We don't need to change any of these other values. We'll just keep them at their default. We're not going to package the artifact in a zip file for this example, so we'll just say artifact packaging is none. Everything else looks okay. We don't need to change the CloudWatch logs. And at this point, we can go ahead and create a build project. So I click on the Create Build Project button. It takes 20, 30 seconds or so to create the build project. Okay, it's been created. Now, when I create the build project, I'm creating this sort of configuration. It's not actually doing a build. It's just storing the build configuration, the build project itself. If I look down here at build history, you can see that there have been no builds that have been executed. I can look at build details to see more information about the build project itself. You can see the source provider is GitHub, the repository it's pulling from. I can see the environment that I've configured for this particular build. The resources that by default it gives me a small build environment. There are actually, I think, three different sizes of build environments that you can pick from. So by default, it just chooses the smallest one, which is fine. It also tells me where the artifacts are going to be stored and so on. So I've got my build project. Let's go ahead and start a build. I'll click on the Start Build button, and that will then pull up another configuration screen where I have the opportunity here to override sort of some of the default values that I set in the build project. This allows me to sort of like tweak the build values for every build I do. If I wanted to, I could kind of change things on a build by build basis. I don't really need to do that here. So I'll just go ahead and click on the Start Build button. And when I do that, it tells me that I've successfully started a build and gives me a build project ID, this long alphanumeric string, and it shows me a build status. It shows that I've initiated the build and that it's in progress. And what you'll see below is kind of a log output from the build process. It'll show me everything that's going on, everything that the AWS Codebuild service is doing. So it started the build process, and you can see it's actually building or launching a build environment. It's installing the Java. It's installing Java in the application environment. Remember, I specified a runtime environment application framework to install. Is the OpenJDK 8 version. So that was the first thing that was done. So that was installed in the environment. I keep scrolling down, and now it's entering the pre-build phase. So it runs the env command, where it gives me all of the different environment variables that are set up. This isn't something you have to do. I'm just doing this kind of for diagnostic reasons. So all the environment variables, these are key value objects, essentially. I could scroll down and look at all those. And then the next command it runs is the ant command, where it's actually invoking our unit tests. It's handy that all of the commands that are being run are in a sort of bluish color, so they're easy to sort of pick out in the log output. You can see the ant output. It's running unit tests here, and we'll be able to see the results of that unit test. It shows that 4 unit tests ran and there were 0 failures, which is good. It means that our unit tests were successful. And we continue, and now it enters the next build phase. So it enters the build phase, and here it's using ant again to perform a Java build. And this is all the log information related to that Java build. And that Java build was successful, and so then it entered the post-build phase, where it was uploaded the artifacts then to our S3 bucket. So you can see it says upload artifacts state succeeded. So this looks like a successful build. If we go back to our Java project, then we should see a build run here with a status of succeeded, and it tells us the duration. It took 26 seconds to run that build. Now that wouldn't be a real common sort of build in the real world. Most builds, will take anywhere from a few minutes to, I've seen builds take a half an hour, depending on all the things that are involved in the build process. If we go to our S3 bucket and click on the S3 bucket, we'll do a refresh here. You should see that now there is a folder in the bucket, Java-project. I'll click on that, and then there's a dist folder. And then finally, we'll see our output artifact, rectangle.jar. That is the output artifact generated from that build I just completed. And so Codebuild automatically uploaded that artifact into my S3 bucket. Pretty cool. This is a really, really handy service. And if you were to try to do this with something like Jenkins, well, I mean, you would have to spend a lot of time and effort just setting up a basic Jenkins server and giving it, the simplest of configurations. Never mind having to address all the security concerns and so on. Having a service like Codebuild available is really a luxury because it can greatly simplify the process of producing these sort of builds. Now, you watched me create a build manually using the Codebuild service, but in most cases, we don't want to create a build manually like that. We would prefer to use infrastructure as code, meaning that we'd like to use a service like CloudFormation to automatically build create that Codebuild project for us. And let me look at a code editor and take a look at a template file. And this template file is one that you'll have the opportunity to work with a little bit. This template file, this CloudFormation template file, defines a Codebuild project. And so it's got a few different resources in it. The first being it has an artifact bucket, an S3 bucket that we're defining. And there's a bunch of stuff I added in this particular template. For example, I'm specifying that any objects that are stored in this bucket should be encrypted at rest. And I actually created an artifact bucket policy, which also reinforces that. So there's an S3 bucket policy, which basically says that any object that's stored in this S3 bucket has to be encrypted, and the S3 service will not allow you to store an unencrypted object in this bucket. This is just some additional configuration code that I added to the S3 bucket just to ensure that everything is encrypted. But the key part of this template is this resource, the AWS Codebuild project resource. This is defining the build project. If I look at the properties, it shows that there's an artifacts property. And the artifacts property is defining where the build artifacts are going to be stored. So the location is set to the artifact bucket. I'm using a reference to that S3 bucket, which has been created in the template. And I'm specifying the name of the artifact that should be stored, and also specifying that it's going to be packaged as a zip archive. There's also an environment property where I'm defining the sort of the type of build server that's going to be used during the build process. The compute type is a build general 1 small server. The image is the AWS Codebuild standard 2.0, which is what you saw me use when I manually created the project. The type is it's using Linux as the type. I'm defining a service role, which I'll show you here next. And that was done automatically for us during the manual process. But when we when we create the build project using CloudFormation, we have to also specify the role that we want to use. And then we have a source property, and the source property is specifying where the source code is coming from. In this case, for the location, I'm using a parameter to specify the project URL and also specifying the fact that it's coming from GitHub as well. Under the app build role, then, I'm defining an IAM role, which is the role that the Codebuild project is going to use for the service role. And you don't have to necessarily understand every single part of this role, but it's essentially, think of it this way: the build server is assuming this role during the build process, much like an EC2 instance is assuming an instance profile role. And that allows the EC2 instance to do things like connect to an S3 bucket to download objects from that bucket. Same sort of situation. The service role is allowing the build service to access the S3 bucket that's being created, where we're storing and retrieving output artifacts from. And then finally, there's a build log policy as well. And this is used by the build service to log the build output to CloudWatch logs. So the key point here to understand is that, yes, while you can create these build projects manually, we always prefer to create the build project in CloudFormation. And this build project is going to use that build spec.yaml file, which is stored as part of the application source code. So that's kind of how the two pieces tie together. And you'll have ample opportunity to work with CloudFormation and to build a code build project using code.